Okay. So let's jump back in. Let's see. Who wants to recap where we have been so far?
I can give it a try.
Okay. Say a few
Um,
about the first essay, and you and I haven't really talked about the culture industry essay that much, right? Because you were gone for a week, and then last week we didn't really touch on it. Is that right?
that's right. I watched the video though between you
Okay.
and Justin talking
Okay.
about it. So I'll try my best. But I think just in very simple and broad words, what I've kind of gathered is that there is a sense of the domination of concepts and kind of form over content, especially in this last essay. Um, and that
Okay. Maybe
is,
maybe you could start from a even you sort of started right in the middle of things, right?
oh,
So
okay.
maybe try to set the stage a little bit more because
Well, let me see.
the reason
Uh,
why it's important to do that is because it's things will just make a lot more sense if you start to recognize kinds of patterns of thinking that
mm,
they seem to have that operate in the background, that you can fit their various claims or their various, examples or whatever into. And in order to get that, it's good to try to start at a sort of general level or try to think about what the background reasoning is or what the style of reasoning is, etc., as part of the um, exposition.
okay. I guess, well, they open up with enlightenment and how it was a device to conquer fear, but in reality, what it ended up with is some sort of uh I guess oppression, you could call it. Um
Well,
and
why is that in quotation marks oppression?
because I don't know, I guess maybe oppression was like too big of a word.
I don't think it
Maybe
is.
oh okay, okay. Well,
I
we could
mean,
leave it
they
at
the
that.
word that they use or that I should look up the German word, but the word that is consistently used in this translation is domination,
Yeah, that's what I was
which
thinking of too.
means
So I was
having lordship over
mhm.
or having some kind of mastery over, right? That's what domination means. And why does reason lead to domination?
um because everything will be turned into a system of universals and concepts, which will then reduce everything down to generalities.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you could even say on their analysis, and there may be arguments against this, but on their analysis, actually, it's not even that reason leads to domination. Reason just is domination,
Hmm.
right? That what it means to deploy rationality is to exert mastery over.
Hmm. So it's in the very nature of
Yeah,
to
it's in the very
reasoning,
nature of
right?
reason itself, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's fairly hard to think of, and partially you see a commitment to materialism there, because I
Hmm.
guess you could sort of think of reason as nothing but a consistent mental exercise or something like that. But whenever you actually use reason in the world, it always has this aspect of mastery to it. It could either be because it's instrumental reason, but even if it's like reason in the search for the good, you're still trying to somehow grab a hold of and um, establish mastery over your life, over your situation, right? So I think that the flip side or the dialectical nature of reason is that it promises both, it both promises liberation and provides domination.
Hmm.
And in fact, liberation is just the other side of domination because exactly through domination does it promise liberation. So liberation from nature as as a dangerous force, liberation from I suppose the state or the polis, the political situation, if you're living under a king, etc., right? I mean, so one thing that they do, and we haven't talked much about Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? I think you and I have mentioned that a couple times, right, Arshia?
Uh,
Or
I
we've talked
don't
about it a couple
recall.
times. There's a famous essay by Kant called the whole title is An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment?
Uh,
It was like a competition essay. And I think like Moses Mendelssohn, which I think was the maybe the grandfather of Felix Mendelssohn, who was a Jewish philosopher in the 18th century, I think actually won the contest, if I'm remembering correctly. But Kant also wrote an essay. And Kant's essay is more famous, but Moses Mendelssohn is reasonably well known too. But there are maybe just a couple things to take from that essay which are important here. Um, the most important is that Kant gives a definition for enlightenment, and his definition is, uh, I'm paraphrasing, but the definition is something like um, departure from self-imposed immaturity.
hmm.
It's a little bit hard to translate the German because the word that Kant uses there is Unmündigkeit for immaturity, and Unmündigkeit means um, it literally means to be like not have yet reached the age of adulthood. It means immaturity, but it also has this sense of being silenced in it because it has the word mouth in it. It's your unmouthiness, Unmündigkeit. Um, And so to escape from, so first of all, why is it self-imposed? Why is a lack of enlightenment self-imposed immaturity? Because everybody has access to universal reason, right? And it's only if you fail to live up to your potential as a rational being that you will fail to be enlightened. So therefore, it's self-imposed. Um, But also within that idea of departure from immaturity is this idea that there is only one true authority in the moral universe or in the political sphere, and that is reason, not the king, not the church, not the father, reason, right? And that seems like a fairly straightforward, almost sort of like platitude, right? I mean, like the idea of, you know, democracy as a rational conversation between equals about how to uh, form and lead a society. That is essentially the claim that no one is supposed to be above the law. No one is supposed to just have authority for no particular reason or just for, chance or insignificant reasons. They were born into it, or, God has chosen them, or this kind of thing. No, it's only reason. All authority, all political authority on the Enlightenment scheme stems from reason. So that's Kant's claim, basically. And then the other thing that is maybe useful to know about that essay, which they don't really talk about here much, but it might come up, is that Kant um, then has this division between public and private reason or public and private uses of reason. And there, what he means is that um, the public use of reason is essentially um, the freedom that everyone should enjoy to criticize the government, criticize society, but as private citizens, they have to obey the laws of the society. And Kant quotes Frederick the Great, who was the king of Prussia at the time, um, in the following way. Frederick the Great says, argue as much as you like about whatever you like, but in the end, obey. And what Kant's argument there is that in order to have a society where you can have rational discourse about the best way to lead a society, the best way to form a society. In order to have democracy, you first have to have a well-functioning society because if it's complete anarchy, then you can't have democracy. You can't have a rational society. All you'll have is, Hobbes's war of all against all. Um, so you still have to have the imposition and the obeying of laws, but that's only as a private use of reason. The private use of reason means if I'm a priest, I have to do all the things that the church tells me to do, even if I want to criticize the church, or if I am, whatever, a philosopher, I can't become a complete anarchist and try to destroy the government. What we would want to do is use reason to reshape the government, but then that's going to be in the public sphere, writing newspaper articles, teaching courses on political theory, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. That's public use of reason. And the main criticism of that approach, which you see today, um, is essentially the idea that it's a very small subset of society that, even in a well-functioning, law-obeying society, has recourse to the public use of reason. In other words, and certainly in Kant's day, it was wealthy white men, you know. Um, and even wealthy white men, in many cases, are quite plausibly only cogs in the machine. If you're only a cog in a machine, then you never really have the chance to use reason to affect society because the machine will just beat you back down. That's most obvious in the case of the marginalized in society. I mean, if you're marginalized, if you truly are 100% just a cog in a machine, there's nothing that, well, first of all, you probably don't even have access to the um, intellectual tools that would be required to contribute to the public use of reason. But even if you did, you don't have the platform, right? And so, um, what do you do if you are in an unjust society and can't actually uh, avail yourself of the public use of reason? So that's a typical criticism of that way of thinking. But in any case, this idea of reason as the departure from self-imposed immaturity, that's the concept of reason that they're working with pretty much throughout the whole book, right? That
Mhm.
it means that what human beings want to do in the use of reason is, in some sense, in addition to becoming their own masters, right, liberating themselves from dogma, right? They also, through reason, have to present themselves, or reason presents itself as being self-caused. In other words, um, it's a view of society where people pull themselves up by the bootstraps, right? And in fact, literally in that formulation of it, because very often people like to point out that there is something um, paradoxical or something recursive or whatever about the phrase pull yourself up by your bootstraps, because you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It means that you're starting from nowhere. You're born of yourself. But that's what reason demands. Reason is self-caused in that way. And if your essence as a human being or as a citizen or whatever is that you're a rational agent, a rational subject, you also are self-caused, right? And that's one thing that they point to quite often, this sort of conundrum about reason, which is that there seems to be something kind of illusory about it because we can never be self-caused. It doesn't even make any sense. We're always from somewhere. That's why, the purely rational point of view is sometimes called the view from nowhere,
Oh, because
right?
of that circularity, right?
Yeah, exactly. That it's trying to be a perspectiveless perspective. In other words, there's no perspective because it sees the entirety, but then that means that it's not a perspective, but then it is a perspective, right? So, that's one of the circularities about it. And you can see that if you're going to take like a Freudian tack and talk about repression, right? The demand for rationality is actually a mode of repressing your dual nature as a natural organism and rational subject, right? So that one thing that reason wants to do is pretend like we didn't come out of nature. And that's to repress that dimension of our experience, right? But then one thing that Freud often describes is the return of the repressed, which is that you repress one trauma, but that trauma never disappears. It always comes back in different forms. And so the violence of nature that we repress comes back through reason as domination, right? So that's one of these other sorts of ways of thinking about the connection between domination and reason, you know. But the other thing is that Horkheimer and Adorno, as materialists, are in some sense kind of close to the American pragmatists, in as much as they think that value is really just a way of referencing what sorts of activities people are engaged in, you know, so that if you something is good just in case it's how you spend your life, provided that, you provided that you think that you are pursuing your interests. It's possible that you could be spending your life in a way that you feel is against your interests, in which case you would view it as bad. But if it is in line with your interests, then however you spend your life just is good. That's what it means to be good, right? Another way to look at that is simply, reason, morality, etc., as something like biological adaptations, so that even conceptualization, conceptualization is a particular adaptation that human beings have, Homo sapiens has, that enables them to navigate their world more efficiently, dominate their world by being able to recognize things as either, dangerous or beneficial. Conceptualization is really, it sort of becomes sublimated into this lofty rhetoric of um, uh, reason as sort of unmoored from the world, but its origin is in the interests that organisms have. It's an adaptation for interfacing with the world and um, enhancing your chances of self-preservation.
Hmm.
So,
That seems like a really awfully pessimistic reductionist view.
well, what's the alternative?
I guess that maybe there is some sort of like mysticism that isn't necessarily in opposition with the fact that human beings are biological beings and there has been an
Well,
evolution to the
okay,
knowledge of
but
that.
the thing is that if you shut down the transcendent world, right? If you want to be a materialist, and I don't think, I mean, there are people today that are dualists and mind-body dualists or people that give rational arguments for the existence of God even today, right? But by and large, that's not really a viable path in the intellectual sphere. Um, so unless you want to say something like, no, there really is a domain of things like souls and spirits and whatever else might be there, gods or whatever, that really exists, where there is like an extensive definition to these things. They're not just concepts or ideas. No, they really exist, maybe immaterially, but they exist in reality. Unless you want to claim that, you're always going to come back to the the explanation of any mental activity as essentially motive. If I mean, one thing you could say is that no, everything really just is chance, and there is no motivation. There is no um, There is no causal mechanism by which we could ever explain anything. Everything is completely random and inexplicable. You could say that. But if you want to have explanations, you're always, for mental activity, you're always going to come back to, well, it must be something that the organism does, even if mindlessly, it does it and it's motivated by the need for self-preservation. I mean, so like even mystical experience, what would be if you want to have things like motivations or explanations for why this happens, um, mystical experience, I mean, it's sort of like morality is maybe an easier thing to talk about because I don't know exactly what we mean by mystical experience, but like you could easily say that, well, morality, ethics, the good, doing the right thing really is just something that certain organisms do because whatever biology impels them to do it because it increases their survival chances because they're more likely to survive as a group than if they're individuals out in the wild. And morality is one thing that binds the group together and also exiles any member of the group that might be a danger to that unity. It's like actually, if you watch in the 2000s, around 2005, there was a Werner Herzog documentary about penguins. Actually, no, I'm thinking of March of the Penguins, which is a different one. Um, and penguins do this. They exile members of their. It's not always clear to the researchers why, but presumably it must have something to do with the danger that a certain penguin's behavior has to the survival chances of the rest. That's what morality does. That's why we punish people,
Hmm.
right?
And that's
Or we try to rehabilitate them, but it's all in the interests of maintaining the unity of the group, which on a materialistic understanding is just something that, enhances the survival prospects for the group, right? So that's why I ask you, so what's the alternative? It seems like the only alternative is pretty strong dualism that believes in the actual, you know, extensional existence of all these kind of ghosty kind of things. So I don't know.
but what about not the dualist view, but what about there being a another kind of let me see how I can phrase this. Because it's a really complicated thing I'm thinking about.
Mhm.
I was thinking maybe out of this materialist level and system, being born another way of experience that
Yeah.
puts more emphasis on, uh, say, things as simple as feelings or emotions or desires or things
Well,
like that.
yeah. I mean, I guess
Which,
maybe that would be aesthetics. You could.
yeah, exactly.
What
Like
what
maybe
what I
maybe an aesthetic.
what I would point out about everything that I just said about a materialist view of the world as boiling down to self-interest, self-preservation, etc., is remember that I did give you the other alternative, that is, there is no explanation.
Mm,
And actually, if you're a materialist and you want to explain, you're still doing something basically theological, right? Because notice that I keep having to say, I kept checking my language so that I said motivation instead of purpose or whatever. But honestly, like if we're talking about the why morality exists as a biological adaptation or something, we're essentially asking why does it exist? What's its purpose, right? And that's not the sort of question that if you're at least a positivist scientist, you're not supposed to ask that kind of question. So you could try to say motivation, right? That is to say, if I say motivation, then it's no longer this weird sort of backwards causality where there's some kind of future purpose that is the cause of action now, right? We talked about that before, right?
hmm
I mean, that's supposed to be one of these things that makes the idea of final causes implausible. That what does it mean to, especially if it's not conscious, if there's no sort of mental model or picture of what the future goal is. What could it possibly mean that a future goal is the cause of action now, if the action predates it and so on? So if you talk about motivation, then that's maybe kind of a way to get out of it. But even so, if what you're interested in is explanation, then you're back to what Nietzsche says in Aphorism 125 of the Gay Science. You think you're an atheist, but actually you've just given God a new name, right? So because the other alternative is really actually that there is no explanation, and all these sorts of scientific stories that we tell ourselves that make us feel powerful and meaningful and so on. Um, I mean, maybe one thing we could say is that it helps us predict certain things. It helps us, predict that the molecules will move in this direction or that direction or whatever. But if we think that that explanation, that power of explaining or that activity of explaining is somehow adding depth to our lives, it's actually just a theological commitment because the universe doesn't really care. The universe just does its thing, and there is no particular value or anything to it. Um, so, yeah, what I would say is it is kind of complicated because, if you want to then go to the other extreme and say, well, no, there nothing can truly be explained sufficiently, right? Then you're almost kind of in a vaguely mystical situation, right? Because the definition of mysticism is that it is alien to reason, right? Um, so you could have a materialist mysticism if what you mean is that everything is physical, everything is material, but nothing can ever be truly explained. Then that's a sort of materialist mysticism, I suppose.
Mm.
Um, but most people aren't happy with that. One thing they talk about a lot, and I don't remember if it was, I think it's in the culture industry essay, or maybe it's in the essay on Juliet, but they talk about how, so they problematize this idea of purposelessness without purpose. Or no, I'm sorry, what am I saying? No, purpose, purposiveness with purpose. The Kantian idea from what, the third moment or whatever, the aesthetic, or the analytic of the beautiful. Because they often say that that is not only a necessary condition for aesthetic experience, it's also something that describes modern activity in its entirety. What that means is if you think that society or whatever the world has purposiveness, but there is no purpose, then it's a um, severe focus on means and not ends, right? Because we just said there are no ends. There's no purpose. All there is purposiveness, which is essentially instrumental rationality, which is the sort of hanging together in a coherent way that purposiveness allows, but there is no reason for it. There is no good, there's no end to it. Is it clear what I'm saying?
Kind
Let me try
of.
to make it a little bit more clear. We've said that instrumental reason is essentially, you could call it just logic as opposed to reason, if what we want to mean by reason is that it's tied to the search for the good. The search for the good is really the final purpose. It's the purpose of purposes. It's the form of forms, right? But the good means that it's that is the end, the purpose, the goal of everything, right? So like from the point of view of asking why, if I ask you, why are you here on Zoom right now? Then you'll say to learn about Horkheimer and Adorno. And then I say, why do you want to learn about Horkheimer and Adorno? So that I expand my intellectual horizons or whatever. Why do you want to expand your intellectual horizons? Because it will make my life richer. Why do you want your life to be richer? Because at some point you'll just end up with uh, you know, the only answer left will be because it's good, right? And I think we're only like one or two steps away from that. Expand your intellectual horizons, makes your life richer. Why do you want your life to be richer? Because it's good to have a rich life, right? I mean, that's pretty much, and then, well, why do you want goodness? And then you say, what are you talking about? That's self-justifying. I want goodness because it's good.
Well, rather than goodness, could you just say because I like it? Like, does it have to be a
So
claim that
why do you
it's
want to do something you like?
uh,
Because
there
it's
could be things
pleasurable.
that
Why do
I
you want
like.
pleasure? Because pleasure's good.
Yeah, but does good carry this connotation of like a universal good or like a moral good?
Well, not necessarily. If we restrict reason to instrumental reason, then it stops short of the absolute good. But
Okay.
the point is that if we are asking the question why, the final answer will always be because it's good. Or the final answer would be I don't have an answer, which would be the point of view of instrumental reason. But then that's not an answer. If you want to continue on asking, then you'll end up with the good as the end, right? Okay, so purposiveness without purpose means we shut down the good, or we shut down the question of absolute ends, or even particularly higher order ends or anything like this. All we have is the local purposiveness of logic, coherence, this kind of thing, right? Or instrumental reason. But and so it has this sense of um, inclination towards there's a trajectory to it. That's what the purposiveness is. But there is no end, right? And so that you could think of instrumental reason as reason construed only in instrumental terms as a formulation of purposiveness without purpose. Is that clear? Um, and I think it is in the second essay, which we didn't read, but they talk about how modern society, perhaps society through all its various instantiations as well, but certainly once we um, become, pluralists or relativists about what's good, um, we still want to have the sense that our lives are not a waste, that society is not just a waste of time. And so we replace goodness as an end with just mere busyness. We always want to be busy, but there's no particularly deep reason anyway to um, be busy. It's busy in the pursuit of what exactly? So actually, in the culture industry essay, they talk about this. One of the examples they give is um, the successful businessman whose success is merely like an extensional list of all the various things that he's acquired. What it means to be successful is to have a nice car, to have whatever, like a trophy wife or whatever, to have the corner office. But that's not really success. Those are things that might help make your life better, right? But then there's no sense that there is a higher good. It's only those material possessions, those material acquisitions that are taken to be successful. That's the way they say it. Maybe the shorter way to say it is, um, do you want to make money to live, or do you just want to live to make money? Right? And what they're saying is that in modern society, people only live to make money. But making money is supposed to be the means to the end of having the good life, right? But that's purposiveness without purpose. You work really hard, you get successful in a fairly limited material sense, and that's supposed to be its own purpose, right? Like making money is its own purpose. But think about it. I mean, making money is, or advertising is maybe a good way to think about this, right? Like, is advertising um, supposed to be an end in itself, or is it supposed to be a tool towards another end? I mean, it seems like even on the most sort of basic economic market model, advertisement is supposed to be a means towards the end of distributing a product. But at a certain point, advertising becomes the whole thing, so that even the product itself is essentially just mere advertising. And you can also see this in the history of classical music, right? They talk about Beethoven as becoming the paradigm bourgeois entrepreneur, basically. What that means is that once, say, musical activity in Western Europe, let's just talk about Western Europe for now. Once musical activity becomes unmoored from its place in society as um, uh, a aspect of uh, religious worship or whatever else, it becomes quote unquote autonomous art. But as autonomous art, it's really nothing more than a brand, right? That is to say that, you look at Bach, and Bach was a member of a guild, so to speak, and he was working in a way that the music was a means towards maybe like a communal end, like, religious worship or whatever. But what you have with the emergence of autonomous art that is not supposed to have any social role except to be aesthetic or whatever, you have, again, this sort of motion towards purposiveness without purpose, where it's just the mere activity of making music, but not that making music or creating art or having aesthetic experience has any higher purpose. It's just its own purpose. And so, you see with Beethoven, essentially the first composer who became a name brand. It's that Bach during his lifetime wasn't a name brand. He was the composer who worked at the Thomaskirche, right? Or if you look even further back, say, like maybe this is even more obvious if we look at medieval composers, most of whom were anonymous, right? What you have in bourgeois society is this emergence of the individual that is unmoored from their duty to a community. But once you have that, you have essentially now, if you were to ask, so maybe you can think about this in your own situation, right? It's like, what are you contributing to society by being a composer, right? It's very hard to think of much except that, um, there's sort of sense that whenever you present yourself as an artist, and this is all tied up with the idea of having a individual style, that an individual style often ends up being nothing more than a brand for your activity, but there's nothing other than the brand itself, right? There's no communal kind of thing that music fits into as simply a means. The means becomes its own end. And so you have this sort of sense of composer as brand or whatever, composer as entrepreneur, but what's the product that they're selling? Themselves, right? So that's also one way to see purposiveness without purpose. And I would say with scientific explanation, you might see the same sort of thing. If you are a pessimist about explanation and you think that, well, at best, science can help us predict local events or this kind of thing, which essentially just means that it kind of helps us, uh, you know, that could easily be reduced back to self-preservation or whatever. But if you think that science is incapable of really giving deep explanations because there are no explanations, everything is essentially contingent, right? Everything could potentially have been otherwise. Even the laws of nature could have been otherwise. And if you want to ask, yeah, but why this particular set of laws of nature? And you want a real, like, why, a real answer to the why question there, science is going to be silent about that. Um, but then why, if that's the case, then why so much money and activity in the scientific domain? Well, that might also be characterized in terms of purposiveness without purpose. It's just the sheer busyness of science that we find valuable. But science itself is probably going to be incapable of answering the most fundamental why questions, right? So that might be another way to look at it. Okay, so why don't we just, in the interest of time, try to jump into the sections that you were supposed to have read closely, and you give me your best summaries of them, and then I'll give you my summaries, and then we'll see what comes out of that.
So we're starting with the style section.
Yeah, actually, Archie, did you want to respond to anything I just said?
Yeah, well, not the things that you just mentioned previously, but in regards to the new section, I, one of the ways that I was kind of trying to summarize it for myself was the following, and I wanted to kind of check to see if that's correct.
Okay.
And I was thinking, I guess it's the triumph of form over content. Is that
Hmm.
right?
Okay, well, tell me a little bit more about that. Why do you say that?
Because there was a section about how the details are kind of rendered insignificant because of the importance of form. So, oh, actually, here it is. Let me see. So on page 99, it says, like, I think
Let me get there.
it's
Yeah.
okay.
99. Yeah. Okay.
So I think it's talking about romanticism to expressionism, and if I understood it correctly, it's kind of talking about how Um, there it says in music, the individual harmonic effect had obliterated awareness of the form as a whole, and in
Hmm.
painting, the particular detail had obscured the overall composition.
Hmm.
Um, and through totality, the culture industry is putting an end to all that. And there
Hmm.
were the examples with, like, say, hit songs, for instance, how
Hmm.
their overall form is a lot more important than what they really have to say because the overall form kind of dominates the content.
Hmm.
And so in that regard, it seems like the content is just isn't significant anymore in the interest of conforming to the universal form or to the totality of the form.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that they're saying is that there's not a clear distinction between form and content. And in fact, probably what they would say about the culture industry is that it collapses form and content so that there really is nothing outside of the content.
Hmm.
Um, and you can also think of maybe like a correlation between form and content on one side. You can think of historical style and personal style, right? What's the connection there? A lot of it has to do with what is received versus what is original, etc. What do you want to say, Justin?
I was going to say, well, I was thinking about like if you want to use the example of classical music or something, Mozart might fit into very defined forms that are very predictable. But the reason why Mozart is interesting and Salieri isn't is because of the personal touches that they were able to give to these individual moments in such a way that you don't get in mass culture, right? Because that's subsumed into the totality. Um,
Hmm.
like every detail is sort of manicured in a way that you don't get in earlier art.
Yeah, and so that's right. And so those personal touches would be what I think they're referring to as detail, right? Why would detail in Romanticism or Expressionism obliterate the form or obliterate uh, received style?
Yeah, well, I don't know if the my understanding is correct, but it's because we know what the form is already. That's not a surprise. So we don't uh, take interest in that so much as we just sort of forget about it and listen to the personal style.
Yeah, I think it'd be stronger than that. I think what they're saying is that if the piece is sufficiently detailed, in the case, say, of an expressionistic work, what would we say is with respect to the form? We'd say, oh, it's through composed, which really just means it's a unique form, right? Um, which is to say that the more the detail becomes elevated in expressionism, the more difficult it is to make sense of it on a formal analytical point of view, right? And in fact, that's why I think um, certain works like maybe The Rite of Spring, for instance, always sound a lot more modern than the neoclassical works. They always sound a lot more fresh and vibrant and whatever than Stravinsky's neoclassical works because there is this sense of the obliteration of formal tropes, the obliteration of, what you might describe as stylistic platitudes or whatever. And the flip side of that is that it's hard to explain. It's not surprising that certain pieces in music theory get analyzed over and over and over and over and over again in classes and in the literature because they're written in a way that is amenable to analysis. But there is a lot of musical activity, particularly, on their account, they would say that comes out of late Romanticism, Expressionism, this kind of thing, that is by nature difficult to analyze, at least in this sort of formal sense. It's why, um, in fact, my classes are a little bit odd because I like to bring in works that are hard to analyze. But, if you're trying to analyze the first movement of The Rite of Spring, for instance, there's very little that you can say that will, um, you know, develop the sort of formal approaches that uh, we have when we're looking at sonata forms or this kind of thing, or even Wagner. I mean, you could sort of also think of Romanticism. One way that I often describe it is that Romanticism is sort of like when the development section becomes the whole piece, right? Which is to say, constant upheaval of these um, formal pillars, of these kind of stable formal moments in the virtue or by virtue or in the interest of the specific unique development of this specific motive, which is the detail, right? So if you think about like Schoenberg and developing variation or whatever as essentially that kind of idea, what that means is that the form disintegrates, right? It disintegrates just because the whole piece is detailed in that specific way. They claim about the culture industry, however, is that it's kind of similar to expressionism in that the detail is really all that matters. The particular pentatonic vocal flourish um, that you use when you sing the national anthem or whatever is in some sense more important or more salient than, the I guess, what is it, like a bar form or something? It's more important than the form. But the thing is that the details themselves, according to them, this may not be true, but this is what they say. The details themselves are standardized, right? And so you have the disintegration of form in the face of the detail, but then the detail itself is standardized, right? Which is it's always the same pentatonic flourish in every single damn song. It doesn't matter who's singing, right? I think that that's what they're saying there, right? And so. The way that they say it, I'm again paraphrasing, but they say something like, in culture industrial products, there is no intransigent material that um, must that is to say, there is no material that doesn't fit into essentially standardized molds. Intransigent would mean it doesn't fit into standardized molds, right? What they mean by that is that you know, the detail essentially becomes the cliche, but it's a surface level cliche, right? It's not um, the formal cliche is not as important or is not as maybe salient or whatever as the cliche detail. And they make the following claim: a song that runs afoul of standardization, that runs afoul of cliches at the level of the detail will be censored much more harshly than a song that runs afoul of those things at a formal level. In other words, you can get away with not having a 32 bar form. You can't get away with having details that don't fit the standardized expectations of the market, right? That's what they're claiming there. And so, the thing is, though, that they have a sociological analysis of the relationship between the detail and the form, between personal style and historical style. And we might want to try to unpack that sociological analysis now, because one thing, I'll start you off, one thing they say about historical style is that it is socially coercive, that the various historical styles that we know are the specific forms of social coercion of their time rendered in musical form, or rendered, I suppose, in aesthetic form, if we're not just talking about music. But what does that mean? We talked about this a little bit, Justin, but it's important to be clear on this. What is socially coercive about historical style? Oh,
That
kind
it's
of obvious.
what was it?
Kind of obvious, but anyway, go ahead.
Is it that it's like it's included in every instance of any work because
Yeah.
it precedes it?
Yeah, basically, right. I mean, let's say that you want to be an expressive individual composer, and it's time to bring your piece to an end because nothing can go on forever. Um, why is it that Mozart ends all of his pieces the same way? Da 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 da. Why does it always have to end that way? And not just Mozart, but everybody at that period, right? What's interesting is, in tonal music, one of the clearest calling cards of the historical style is the cadence, right? The specific elaboration of the cadence formula, right? Even the cadence formula itself is socially coercive. You didn't choose it. Society chose it for you. Right. But then even at a more detailed level, the specific elaboration of cadences is also, historically stylistic. Here's another way to look at it. I've often had, and this is not going to be, like a knockdown historical argument, but I've often had the sense that if you look at, say, 17th century music, early Baroque music, and Renaissance music is like this as well. Now, they didn't necessarily have the theoretical concept of root position triad, but even so, even lacking that analytical concept, you look at homophonic writing from, say, the 16th through the 17th century, every single chord is in root position. What does that tell us about the values of a society or a subset of society, learned society, literate society that would how does what seems to be a value there?
Learning by imitation.
Okay, can you get any more fine grained than that? Maybe that's too tenuous of an example. As I said, it's not really a historical account. I can give you a more persuasive account, and we'll go forward about 200 years to the Baroque era, the High Baroque, and talk about ritornello form, because I think there's a stronger argument to be made. For me, though, there's something about the groundedness and the vague sense of certainty that root position triads provide that seems to cohere with a particular period in history in which um, the intellectual class believed that knowledge meant absolute scientific knowledge meant absolute metaphysical certainty. And by the 18th century, that falls away and you start to get more complex harmony. But there's something about the simplicity and the certainty of root position triads that seem to be like an expression of certainty as a value. Let me give you a maybe more persuasive account. Why? Okay, let's talk about the structure of um, a concerto grosso, a ritornello form. What would a sociological account of ritornello form look like? What goes on in a ritornello form? What do you have?
The theme comes back again and again.
Okay. And what else happens?
There's a kind of conversation between the solo group and the ensemble.
And what is the most significant difference between what the Ripeño group the big group does versus what the small group does.
Well, the small group is doing different music, and the big group is doing the repeats.
Okay, there's more to it. Let's talk about harmony. Let's talk about motivic use of motives. Let's talk about the relationship between the theme, the ritornello that always comes back, the key areas, how fragmented or not fragmented it is versus what the small group is doing. Now, what can you say?
I have to think back to my music history classes here.
Okay, well, the point is that the big group essentially just what you might say it sort of maintains order, right? What it does is give us typically the full theme, typically either in the home key or in closely related keys. The small group is a lot more exploratory. What it does is move typically around in different, sometimes distantly related keys. Usually it's much more fragmented. Usually it's much more idiomatic for the instruments, which means that it's more unique, more individual, the material is, right? You couldn't have the whole orchestra playing all this stuff. Only one instrument can do that. But then if that's what's interesting, then why is the orchestra there? The orchestra is there to give us these pillars, these moments in the form that we sort of come back to solid ground, which is to say, it maintains order. Why is it that the pieces always end with the full theme by the big group in the home key? Because you have to have the maintaining of order, that has to have the last word. But if that's all that it was, it wouldn't be interesting. You also have to have those exploratory, more maybe you could even think of sort of like experimental or whatever, individual sections in between, right? Um, Actually, if you look at it, it is 18th century ritornello form is um, very similar to what Kant has to say about public and private uses of reason, right? That is to say that um, there's this tension or this relationship between, um, sort of exploration of ideas, either harmonic ideas, motivic ideas, virtuosic ideas, whatever. But that also always has to be circumscribed by the order of the system, right? So that there are these little pockets of exploration, but as Frederick the Great says, in the end, obey. In the end, come back to the full theme by the group in the home key. But if you look, I have to say the N word, unfortunately, to reference this title. Evil Nigger by Julius Eastman. Okay. That piece is really interesting because it's essentially like a ritornello form. There is a ritornello that comes back, and then there are these little pockets of more exploratory kind of stuff. But in that piece, the ritornello repeats, and then there's more and more time between the repeats. And then the last like 6 minutes of it, it never comes back. And that's combined with this passage from very tonal diatonic music to atonal music. And it's like those little exploratory groups, the public use of reason in Kant's terms, sort of destroys or disintegrates the collective, right? That's what they're describing with expressionism too, right? This idea that there's always this tension or this relationship between the coercion of um, the universal, or the coercion of the group, the collective, and the striving of the individual to somehow find a unique place within that. And in the case of most 18th century music, the collective always gets the last word. In expressionism, the individual sometimes, the detail, whatever, can sometimes completely disintegrate the collective, right? Okay, so that's one way to think about this sort of thing. Now, one thing that they say is that style is a promise. And let me see if I can get the exact language up here. I lost my thing. Let me find it. 1 second. Oh God, why is everything always so hard to find? Where does this start? This starts on page What were the pages that I gave you again? Do you have
On from 99, I think,
from 99 to 104?
or sorry, 98 to 104, I think.
Hmm. I did find one of the things that I mentioned in the talking about there is no intransigent material. They say on page 102, the style of the culture industry, which has no resistant material to overcome, is at the same time the negation of style, right? And so that's what I was referring to, where there's this sort of like collapse into standardized detail, because detail is supposed to be the opposite of standardization. It's supposed to be what's unique. But then if the detail itself is standardized, then there is no resistant material. And for that reason, style collapses because there's no more dialectical tension between um, universal standardization and unique, particular details. It all just sort of collapses into um, platitudinous vocal flourishes and whatnot. Yeah, okay. Um, right. So I was saying that they say that style is a promise. So this is on page 103. Mm, here we have about 5 sentences down what I was describing, where it says the unity. So this is, yes, 5 lines down from 103. The unity of style. You all see that? The unity of style, not only of the Christian Middle Ages, but of the Renaissance, expresses the different structures of social coercion in those periods. So, you could say here they're talking about the Renaissance, and here we would probably want to talk about painting more than music because painting was the paradigm art in the Renaissance. But there it could be something like the interesting um, unity or conflation of um, idealization and naturalness. I don't know that we really have time to develop that. I mean, there's so many interesting ideas that we could develop, but is it clear what I mean by both idealization and naturalness in, say, a Raphael painting? How it's kind of one and the same thing? Oh, really? Oh, good. Okay. Well, then I don't have to say anything more about it.
It's
I
just
know
it's just the idea.
what you're talking about. I don't know that I could like I could try to articulate what you're saying, but I know like yeah, when you look at it, you see like there's obviously an attempt to make it look um realistic, like the perspective and the light or whatever, but also like the human forms or whatever, I guess it's often human forms are in a way that it's like
Here's maybe a fast way to do it. You know that subreddit called Accidental Renaissance?
Mhm.
Why is that interesting? It's interesting because we usually think that photographs are closer to reality, material reality, than paintings because they're less stylized, they're less designed, they're less idealized. Um, and so, therefore, like maybe the paradigm of photographs is that it captures all sorts of detail that are maybe kind of irrelevant to the composition. In a painting, in a Renaissance painting, there really are no details that are irrelevant to the composition, because everything else is just sort of smoothed out. Actually, I was on some forum where someone like posted a thing and they said, "Man, why is it that in all these Renaissance paintings, you've got portraits of people that took a bath like once a decade and none of them have any pimples?" You know, that's the idealization. But what's interesting about it is that as this sort of stripped down idealization. I say stripped down because there are actually fewer details in a painting or fewer relevant details in a painting than in a photograph, because a photograph picks up everything, whereas a painting is only sort of like the idealized version of the scene. Nonetheless, it's also combined with this aspect of naturalness, which makes us not question the techniques that went into produce that idealized image, right? And so it's like when you look at a painting of, say, some portrait or a Raphael Madonna, and then I ask you, okay, what is this painting of? It would actually take quite a lot of um, knowledge and instruction in the techniques of Renaissance painting to then start talking about brush strokes or to then start talking about the specific um, paint type or color choice or this kind of thing, most people would just say, yeah, it's a woman and some children or whatever, or it's a picture of a person or whatever, right? That the technique of producing that idealized image is somehow less visible than the sort of natural uh, image that's produced. And the technique sort of takes a back seat. It's not as obvious. But if you look at, say, like a 20th century painting, even if it's representational, I show you a Picasso painting, people are immediately going to be talking about technique and maybe even to the complete exclusion of representation. You know, even if it is nominally representational, a lot of those Picasso paintings, it's a face, but I'm not sure that it's not that obvious. You kind of have to look for the face in all the lines and squiggles and, you know, color choices and all this kind of thing, right? So that in modern painting, the technique becomes more salient than the sort of natural depiction. There's nothing naturalistic or realistic about a cubist painting. It doesn't look realistic at all. What is salient is the specific choices that the artist made to produce this image, which means that the labor is no longer concealed. Whereas in Renaissance painting, the whole point is to make it look like it was effortless, right? So that it's both idealized, but just because the idealization looks effortless, it looks natural. That is the engine of what Adorno later calls phantasmagoria. And phantasmagoria is essentially a theory of how ideology operates in culture, in a cultural product. Essentially, what it means is that there are sort of two components to it. There's the element of spectacle, and there's the element of naturalness. And essentially, spectacle is there as a sort, well, they're both sort of there as a distraction from labor and the sorts of values that go into a cultural product. But, you know, a couple of weeks ago, I said that, you know, you look at a Hollywood film, for instance, and in addition to the content, in addition to the story, there is also sort of a message, or one could read ideology off how the story is presented, how the movie is made, what the choices are as regards the technical apparatus of putting a movie together. Why this shot? Why that order of shots? Why that angle in the shot? Why that color? You know, why bring these sounds together in this way or that way? That all of those things are what you might describe as the historical style of a film, but that those are expressions of underlying ideologies that are concealed because the movie distracts us with the content, the spectacle, you know, the action sequences or whatever. And so, you know, if you're unreflective, you think, oh yeah, that movie was just about like some dude going around like getting revenge on people. But then it could be that the movie, because of how it's put together, is also suggesting that, so like in the case of Alexander Nevsky, a film by Eisenstein, you know, it's nominally about these Russian knights defending against a German invasion in, I think, the 13th century or something. But in addition to that, every time you see the main character, he's always of a certain type. He's always shot from below in the center of the shot, and so he looks like this imposing, very masculine figure. And in addition to the movie being about the Russians defending against the Germans, it's also telling us about what society and what we as members of society should view as the ideal masculine figure. And that is actually a function of the specific technical choice of shooting this person in this way and choosing that specific actor to be the model of masculinity or whatever, right? You know, that's just a simple example, but you could see pretty much any technical choice, stylistic, historical stylistic choice as being a socially coercive disguising of ideology. Because one of the things that they say is that we tend to accept, because the movie distracts us with the content of the story and not with the formal choices, the technical choices. Um, now I lost my train of thought. Yeah, because of that, because it's the emphasis on a coherent kind of natural story, natural flow to the story. This happens, and then that motivates the next thing, and that motivates the next thing. There's something natural to that flow of the story. We take it all to be realistic. In fact, that approach to filmmaking, where the story, the content of the story presented in a straightforward kind of, normal way, is called realism. And the in the early 20th century, realism was sort of the competitor to another approach called formalism. And formalism is the opposite. Formalism is where the specific technical choices are made more important or more salient or whatever. And what that often means is that to the extent that formal choices become more operative or more salient than content choices, it often makes it seem less realistic. Just in the same way that a Cubist painting by Picasso seems less realistic than a Raphael painting, because the formal choices are the more salient thing and not the content, right? It's the same with film, right? But the thing is that a realist film still has all these formal choices behind it, but the formal choices are essentially disguised in such a way that we no longer pay attention to the sort of values or the sort of messages that they suggest because we're only following the story. And so the story distracts us from the underlying ideology of the technical system that produces the story. And so one thing they say there is that these days, film goers, um, what do they say? Oh yeah, they can watch a film alertly in a state of distraction because you're being distracted. Well, so you're paying attention to the spectacle side of it while being distracted from the fact that what is being presented as realistic, what is being presented as natural, all that underlying ideology actually isn't natural. It could be otherwise, right? We don't have to think of the ideal man as being some, muscular Russian guy who always stands above everybody else and Um, but the movie makes us just sort of accept that because it distracts us from the fact that there's actually an ideological message in the way the thing's put together. So that's one big thing. Do you guys have to go to class today?
I have to go in about
Oh,
-15 minutes.
you do. I
Yes.
thought that there was no class this week.
Well, no, I had to schedule a piano lesson because I
Okay.
have a
Well,
performance.
let's
Yeah.
let's try to blast a few things out over the next 15 minutes. Okay, so that's where they're coming out of in the pages preceding 103. They're talking about how, cultural products disguise their ideology, basically. Um, and so, historical style is socially coercive, and it not only obscures the experience of the subjects in which the universal was locked away, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Um, Even works which are called classical, like the music of Mozart, contain objective tendencies which resist the style they incarnate, which is to say that, the individual composers are always trying to somehow wrest something unique, original, individual out of the coercion of style. I should also maybe say one thing really quickly, that why is there so much focus on individual experience here as somehow more valuable or more um, true, perhaps, than what you might call social experience? Anybody have a thought about that?
Isn't that kind of like their whole project in this
Yeah, but
book?
why? What it's tied to a deeper intellectual commitment. And in fact, if you really think about the the connection of terms, social experience, you should think that actually that is probably an incoherent concept.
Mm.
Why is social experience incoherent?
because experience is an individualistic thing, and when it's social, you can't have an individualistic social thing because it's a
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say
paradoxical statement.
individualistic. I would just say individual.
Oh, okay,
Because
individual.
the adding the istic is to try to make the individual universal.
Ah, right. Okay. Yes, yes,
Yeah, so
yes.
actual experience is never general. Society generalizes across individuals. That's just its structure. That's what it means. I mean, there may be other ways to think about it, but I think that what they're saying is that what they're interested in is not a sort of Platonic, very general idea of truth. They're talking about truth as actual, as embodied materially now in this real experience, and not simply as an instance of a general concept experience.
And
So that's what, yeah, so go ahead.
is this a matter of morality for them? So is it a moral commitment that they're trying to drive this project?
Um, as I said last week, the moral commandments are kind of hard to characterize because it's not clear um, whether the world can actually be changed by moral commitments. I will also say that despite the fact, I don't think in this essay, but in the previous essay, the essay on the Marquis de Sade and whatnot, they have a lot of vitriol for Stoicism because, Stoicism, just the cheap and dirty version of it, is that Stoicism views the human condition as incapable of changing everything in reality except for your attitude. But it does seem to me that they're kind of stoic in as much as they are pessimists, or at least as Adorno is a pessimist. Because what is the moral commitment? Well, maybe it's just you have control over your own attitude towards the false reality of capitalism or whatever. But if you can't change it, then there's a sort of resignation there. But what I would say is that this notion of the individual as the actual is probably closer tied to their view of truth. We don't know necessarily what the moral imperative here is, if there is one. But certainly, I think we could say that they think that what really exists is material reality, the actual experience, not possible experience, not general experience or universalized concepts of experience. No, actual experience is true, right? And that's why there's this emphasis on the individual striving to actually get in touch with reality, actual material reality, and not the sort of idealized, generalized concept of reality, right? But then these social forms are coercive in the sense that they want to strip experience of its actuality, of its uniqueness, of its individuality, and replace it with a standardized, conceptualized, generalized view of human life. Right. Okay. So, but what I wanted to say, because this is important, they say this is about halfway through the page. And in fact, the previous owner of this volume that was made into a PDF actually highlighted it themselves. So you'll probably be able to find it in every work of art. You see that? It's halfway through the page. It's the first kind of gray line.
Which page is this?
It's page 103.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. I'll just read this. I'll read about 4 lines or so. In every work of art, style is a promise. In being absorbed through style into the dominant form of universality, into the current musical, pictorial, or verbal idiom, what is expressed seeks to be reconciled with the idea of the true universal. This promise of the work of art to create truth by impressing its unique contours on the socially transmitted forms is as necessary as it is hypocritical. So keep that in mind, hypocritical. And then I'm going to fast forward to, well, okay, actually, if you, if you look at the next bit of gray um, lines, the next sentence that is not outlined, I'll just start reading that. And then it's towards the end of that sentence that I think the most important bit comes. The moment in the work of art by which it transcends reality cannot indeed be severed from style. That moment, however, does not consist in achieved harmony, in the questionable unity of form and content, inner and outer, individual and society, but in those traits in which the discrepancy emerges, in which the discrepancy between individual and society, the discrepancy between form and content, inner and outer, where that emerges, that is the moment in the work of art by which it transcends reality. And then they say, in the necessary failure of the passionate striving for identity. This is really, really fascinating and kind of complicated and hard to put together. But why will the striving for identity, that is to say, as they say earlier, the striving to impress unique contours on socially transmitted form, why is that going to fail? One thing we might say, let's just throw out all the style stuff and just get kind of formal and logical with this. Um, what is the striving for identity? What does it mean to have an identity that is, somehow set free from the social coercion of universality?
It's to defy that universality.
Yeah, okay. What would that mean in terms of concepts? A concept is general, universal, etc. An instance
It,
of a concept is a particular. Okay, so identity would mean if what we want to do is be free of universality, then it means being free of the concept, the particular as particular, and not just as an instance of a concept. That's what he describes as the non-identical, right? I hope that part's clear, right? It's like,
mhm.
okay. So then what is self-defeating about the struggle for identity?
Well, it's that every even if it's a particular, it's always going to be an instance of a concept. Is
Why?
it that?
Why would it always be an instance of concept? It's right there in the word, identity. You can have a
Oh,
kind of, yeah, go ahead.
because it's identical to that concept. Is it?
Well, the thing is that, yeah, we could even, this is probably rough and not a, true synonym, but we could even replace the word identity with concept, right? The search for a concept for yourself, well, that is a paradox because what we want to be a self, to be a true individual is to be non-identical, not a concept. But then the search for yourself as concept means the search for your non-conceptual concept, right? That's like a formal way to look at it, right? That, it's sort of interesting, right? Because people talk about universality as a form of oppression quite often, right? Why would universality be a form of oppression?
Because it generalizes.
It generalizes, right? And so if you don't fit the definition, um, of the universal, there's a problem with you. You need to be purified. You need to get out, right? You are either exiled from the system or whatever, in really drastic situations, you might be executed or whatever. Um, okay, so we see universality as potentially oppressive, but it turns out that it seems like Horkheimer and Adorno are arguing for a sort of universality, but it is everything that is not captured by the universal. That word everything there has a universal function, right? It's this kind of mind-bending way of thinking that almost feels like looking at an optical illusion or something. Right? But it's like, what it means to be so if we are talking about there may be a couple different ways to define universality. You could define universality as maybe even being a synonym for abstraction or generality or this kind of thing, which would maybe be like an intentional way of thinking about it. But you could also think of universality extensionally, which is to say all the stuff, right? Which is not abstract. And that's the sort of universality they seem to be arguing for. Actually, everything that's there extensionally and not universality simply as a generalized, you know, umbrella term, which is going to strip people of their actual lives, of their actual humanity in the interest of social coercion, universal coercion. But then we would want to ask, okay, so then what are like the necessary and sufficient conditions for the non-identical? I mean, I'm not sure that we could ever answer that question because it's it's not exactly a concept. It's the universal that is everything but the generalized concept. Um, but, so that might be one reason that they think that the the struggle for identity is always going to be doomed to failure. Because if you ever do, here's more a material historical example. Once you become Beethoven, and this is actually again related to Kant's theory of genius, right? Once you become Beethoven as an identity, then um, there's a sort of brand, there's a sort of everybody else imitates that. Everybody else learns about what Beethoven did such that it sort of becomes its own rule, but it's no longer um, that sort of struggle for unique identity in the face of the universal. Maybe I could say that more clearly, probably. Let's see if I can say this even more clearly. Yeah, I mean, maybe it makes a little bit more sense to not talk about an individual. Maybe it makes more sense to talk about social movements that we've talked about, like pronouns and that kind of thing before, right? And so, like, you want to establish a concept to fit your experience, but once the concept is formed, then it means that there are right and wrong ways um, to behave such that you fit the concept. You know, so. The idea is that the truth is in the struggle to formulate an identity. But once that identity is formulated, it just becomes another concept, right? So that you don't actually want to be successful in achieving your identity because you don't want to just be a brand. Beethoven does X, Y, and Z. The truth is in the moment that he is striving to achieve that and then failing, right? If he really does, so like maybe Dale Chihuly is a good example of this or something, right? It's like you know who Dale Chihuly is? You don't know Dale Chihuly? You know that glass museum by the Space Needle or whatever.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay, so Dale Chihuly has a very recognizable style, but at the moment that it becomes Dale Chihuly style, it acts just like a logo or a brand or something like this, right? It kind of loses that actual uniqueness. There's something very formulaic or something very kind of industrial about the way that he produces the concept Dale Chihuly style. So that the truth is to be found in the inability. And in fact, we should say that it's on their account, it's logically impossible for identity to ever be the thing that it promises to be when you're searching for it. Because at the moment
So
that you attain it, it's no longer unique, it's a concept.
so once more we kind of reach that conclusion of the journey is the destination,
Well, and that's
right?
exactly it, right? That's something that I've noticed as well, that their project also can be categorized in terms of purposiveness without purpose,
Right.
right? If you think that there is no final synthesis in a Hegelian sense, it's just constant negation all the time, all the way down, and there is no solid ground, that it's all pure becoming or whatever, that's also purposiveness without purpose. And so it's not necessarily, um, I think what they would say is that, yeah, that's just a condition of thought, a condition of the modern period, perhaps the modern particular crystallization of what thought does. And I think that it's probably a foregone conclusion when you shut down the transcendental sphere, I mean, or the transcendent sphere rather. If you think that there is no God function, either God or something else, science, whatever, if there really is nothing like that, then of course you're at least going to have the second half of that construction without purpose. And then if you want your activity to seem meaningful, then it's going to be purposive, but there is no purpose. And that's just, I think, a feature of the death of God, right?
Mm,
That you still want to find meaning, even though you know that there is no final meaning, right? Well, that's going to be purposiveness without purpose. Um, we will need to say a word about, or two about tragedy. I could probably, you're already late, so why don't you just take 10 more minutes?
no, no, I can't. It's a private lesson. It's
Do you have 5 minutes? Do you have 2 minutes?
I'll be late, Dr. Hodge. It's gonna
Well, you can leave. I'll record it and then you can watch the last 5 minutes.
okay, okay, yeah. Please send it to me.
Yeah,
That'd be
okay.
great. Thank you so much. See you
Yep.
later.
See you later. Um, so, the same basic kind of structure can be seen in what they have to say about tragedy. Um, one kind of problem with this essay is that if you don't know a lot about Attic tragedy, the tragedy of authors like Aeschylus and Sophocles and whatnot, it might not be super obvious what they're alluding to. Can you like let me know anything about what's in the back of your mind when you think about like uh, Oedipus the King or any of those tragic plays? What are some associations, if any, that might be floating around for you?
uh, a predictable form, a kind of I don't know, a kind of sympathizing with the protagonist, but
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know so much about this, so I'm just kind of going off of
Okay.
popular knowledge.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's because they only spend 2 pages on it, and if you have some background with it, it's like every single sentence is resonant.
Mhm.
But without that kind of background to draw on, it's not going to be obvious what they're trying to say. I will say a couple things that are significant about both, those plays themselves, but then also the German Romantic um, formulation of tragedy in the works of Nietzsche and others. So I'll say this. One could, um, contra Aristotle, one could see Greek tragedy as the opponent to philosophy. This is Nietzsche's argument. So, first of all, I'll say some of the things that you said are harmonious with Aristotle's view of tragedy, but they're not harmonious with Nietzsche's view of tragedy. Um, Aristotle, in the Poetics, at least the fragments that remain, uh, talks about the tragic form as um, there's a sort of medicinal quality to it, which he refers to under the heading of catharsis, which could mean either purification of bad emotions or clarification of those emotions. And the way that that works is by rendering the incomprehensibility of reality in ideal in an ideal form, which actually uncovers the true essence of reality. Physis. In Aristotle, physis is a word that it's related to physics, but it means when we talk about reality, we're talking about physical reality. What I should say is that Aristotle, contra Plato, is a one-world philosopher. He believes that physical reality and what you might call logical reality, logos or whatever, are one and the same thing. And to the extent that there's any distinction, it's always going to be epistemological. We fail to see the logos in reality when we see it as just bewildering or incomprehensible. But actually, one kind of straightforward way to say that is, if you think that when you say something scientifically accurate, something true about reality, are you talking about reality or are you talking about like your construction of reality? If you think you're really talking about reality, then it means that logos and physis, the physical world and the logical world, actually are either in like a really, really tight fit or are just one and the same thing. Okay. That's kind of a short summary. And what he thinks because of that is that tragedy, in taking something that seems horrible, but rendering it in such a way that there's this kind of logic at work. That is to say, you described it as a particular kind of flow to the story or something like that, right? He talks about it in terms of um, I don't remember. There are three terms, but like the sense of inevitability, that there's a kind of directedness, a logical flow from one event being the cause of the next event, and so on and so on and so on, right? That in itself is uncovering the ideality of reality, even though on the surface level it's horrible and everything, there's something logical to it. And there's more to that, and so on. Nietzsche, however, wants to say that no, actually, tragedy is the opponent to reason. It's the opponent to philosophy because it presents a vision of the world where nothing is explicable. Nothing truly makes sense because, if you think that the world is just suffering, and that tragedy presents the world as suffering, not as the triumph over suffering through reason, but rather at the end of the day, Oedipus has killed his father and his mother's killed herself and he's gouged out his eyes and all this kind of stuff, right? And then you say, well, okay, but it was all logical the way that happened. Yeah, that doesn't leave the suffering. The suffering's still there as a basic fact, right? If that's your vision of the world, then putting suffering into a logical order doesn't solve the problem of suffering. You're just left with suffering as an unanswerable question, right? That's kind of the basic picture, right? Okay, so those are the two primary ways of looking at the relationship between tragedy and philosophy. I would say that Horkheimer and Adorno are taking more of a Nietzschean approach to tragedy. Couple other things to throw out there. So there's this idea of fate in Attic tragedy. It's called Moira in Greek. Um, it's this idea of a blind, amoral force that has no reason to it. Oedipus just suffers because he must suffer. And in fact, if you look at the play Oedipus, Oedipus the King, the original title is Oedipus Tyrannos, which at the time could mean king or tyrant. Um, so, if you look at the play Oedipus, there's some there's some exceptions to what I'm going to say, but the basic picture is that Oedipus does everything right. He, you know, he knows that his polis is being cursed uh, because the previous king has been murdered, and he stops at nothing to bring the murderer to justice. The only problem is that he's the murderer, right? And so there's this sense that doing the right thing ends in tragedy. right? Doing the logical thing. Because one thing that there is a seer, I think his name is Tiresias, who warns Oedipus not to investigate too closely, because the more he knows, the more catastrophe will befall him. But Oedipus is, in some sense, the avatar for this kind of rational, autonomous subject. He stops at nothing. He wants to find the truth, but the truth destroys him, right? So that's, basically Nietzsche's picture of tragedy, that it doesn't show us that even though the world seems meaningless and painful, that there's a basic logic to it. It shows us that logic, the search for truth, the will for knowledge, the will to do the right thing ends in tragedy, right? Um, and so, one upshot of Oedipus as the autonomous subject is that what he wants to do is become his own master, become a master of the world through reason. But the subject of tragic, or the structure of tragic fate is such that he must fail because autonomy, rationality, morality is not enough to overcome fate, right? Okay. That's, I think, probably enough of a background. There is maybe one extra thing, although they don't talk about it so much in the culture industry essay, but another conceit of tragedy. This is true of the Oresteia by Aeschylus. It's true of the Oedipus plays. It's also true, by the way, of certain political treatises like Plato's Republic or the Communist Manifesto, which is that there is always, tragedy always presents the conflict between reason as um, an ideal organizing principle to society and nature. Because here's kind of a short way to understand this. It's no coincidence that both in communism and in Plato's Republic and elsewhere, the family is more or less disintegrated as the social unit in virtue of a view of society where everyone is a rational individual and where society is organized through rational principles. Because the thing is that even though we can always put together some idealized rational view of how society should be, we always have to contend with the fact that it's nature that supplies the citizens. And the way that Kant describes this in kind of a acerbic way is that from the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever made. So that there's this tension between rationalized, idealized society and the human as both rational, but then also as an irrational, natural organism that comes from a family and is not self-produced through reason, right? That's another conceit in tragedy that's, I think, kind of significant. So um, maybe I could ask you if you want to say anything about what you gleaned from pages 122 through 124, and then I'll talk about what I got out of it.
Yeah, let me take a quick look at it again, see what I highlighted. Yeah, the most important takeaway is uh, that the culture industry um, has made tragedy routine, as they say. It is normalized tragedy or um, has presented it in such a way um, that one might subscribe to it and kind of um, become kind of desensitized to it, that they're willingly people are willingly participating in their own tragedy.
Yeah, let's try to put it in terms that will really point up the self-undermining tension of the culture industry in tragic terms. Okay, so I think if you were to describe it in terms of fate, tragic fate, it should be that rationality in disenchanting the world, in um, decentering myth and this kind of thing should have no place for ideas like fate, especially if we're self-caused autonomous agents, etc., right? Fate is an old myth that, pre-scientific societies might have used simply because they weren't smart enough to explain scientifically what's going on and all this kind of thing. But enlightenment should free us from fate,
Mhm.
right? So, becoming free of your self-imposed immaturity means, among other things, saying that you can change the world as a rational agent. So you're free of fate. But fate comes back in the culture industry. How does fate come back in the culture industry? It's
Uh,
essentially everything you just said, but think about it in terms of, their claim in the first essay that enlightenment is its own myth, that there is always something mythical about the vision of the world that enlightenment provides. And in this case, we're going to be talking about fate as an aspect of that. What is fatalistic about the culture industry?
um, oh, well, just that it doesn't give you an option, right? Like it exists outside of it exists outside of like the Nietzschean sense of like what philosophy should be, and that it just uh presents the things already for you,
Yeah,
and give you a choice whether or not to subscribe to it.
the world is already set up within the interests of capitalism. It's something that they'd say, yeah, the world already is set up in this way. There's no way out. There's no alternative. And in fact, despite the fact that we certainly have a hunger for alternatives and can even maybe vaguely imagine alternatives, the culture industry shows us that any attempt to run afoul or to circumvent or contravene the 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 sort of the destiny that the culture industry provides, the fate that the culture industry provides, always ends up in um, like material failure, right? And so they talk about how, like, okay, so it looks like even in sort of like social realist books, movies, or whatever that are a form of social critique or whatever, it still always presents the world and the capitalist formulation of it as just the way the world is, right? That is to say, um, it shows people suffering and maybe even says that it's bad that they're suffering. But in the case of social critique, realism, Tolstoy, or maybe Tolstoy is too great of an author for them to be talking about. But you look at like, see if I can think of a good, maybe like uh, the Les Mis is a good example, although that's based in Victor Hugo too. Maybe I don't know. Trying to think of a movie that is nominally socially conscious, but is actually just really superficial and cliche. I don't know if you can think of any. Seems like there are lots, but I don't know why I can't think of a single example.
Yeah, I feel like the same way. I'm trying to think of an example.
I mean, I guess they would say they're all if you're going to take a hard line, you'd say they're all superficial because at the end of the day, they show that um, the social conditions of capitalism are somehow natural, just the way the world is. And to the extent that you suffer as a cog in the machine, the upshot is simply that there's something moral about it, that it builds character, or
Mhm.
that even though the world can't change, you can change your attitude towards the world, or this kind of thing, right? That's the version of fate that the system presents, that it can't be changed, and that um, that even like Les Mis or whatever, it doesn't matter. Any form of social critique in the culture industry is always going to present the world as essentially um, fatalistic, that this is just the way the world is. Get real, you know. That phrase, get real, don't, you know, um, succumb to your fantasy of how you would like your life to be. The cold hard fact is that if you try to, whatever, um, free yourself of the culture industry of capitalism or whatever, you're going to end up on your ass in the streets. That's kind of the version of fate that they're showing. And you see that certainly maybe Blade Runner or like Cyberpunk is a good example of a kind of superficial social critique in this exact sense because it does show capitalism is pretty dehumanizing. But it also shows us a vision of the future where it has metastasized to all aspects of human experience, and you know, um, it presents it in a way that shows us that there is no way out. This is what our future is going to look like. And so even though it's critical, it still accepts it as just the way the world is, the way the world is just going to be, because that's the fate of the world. And so that's one way that fate comes back in rationalized society. It was exercised in one move, say in the French Revolution or whatever, or the formulation of the citizen as rational, self-caused agent or whatever. But then it comes back in the system, crushing anybody that tries to oppose it. So that would be one way of seeing that. What else did you get from this? I would say that's like the main thing, but there's a couple other pretty uh, subtle things that are quite interesting. Why do you think they say that tragedy is abolished? And later on, they say the liquidation of tragedy confirms the abolition of the individual.
Interpretation of tragedy. Oh, well, they're talking about that in the context of uh, fascism. Um, and yeah, so I have here the ability to slip through to survive one's own ruin, which has superseded tragedy, is ingrained in the new generation. Its members are capable of any work since the work process allows them to become attached to none. Um, so yeah, it's kind of I think it kind of has this generalizing aspect to it, um,
Mhm.
which
Well, maybe I could ask it this way. I think what you're saying is right. I just like to find shortcuts. I think it has to do with the vision of happiness that the culture industry provides. So tragedy is, this situation where there is no outside to capitalism. There's no alternative. The attempt to find true happiness that is not just beaten down and standardized and, dehumanized by capitalism always ends in tragedy. And then, the culture industry presents that tragedy as something that is character building or whatever, but doing so in a way that still maintains um, capitalism and rationality is the only game in town. Okay. In that picture, what does it mean to be happy or successful or whatever as an individual?
it means to overcome tragedy?
Wrong.
No, it means to not overcome
Tragedy is
tragedy.
liquidated. Tragedy is abolished. So it's not overcoming tragedy. Exactly. It means identifying with the system. To be successful is to identify as an individual with the system and be that person that has the fast car, the trophy wife, and the corner office. But that just means you are being subsumed by the universal, by, the fate of capitalism. You just said, well, if you can't beat them, join them.
Mhm.
That's the only vision of happiness that it allows.
Mhm.
Because the attempt to break out of that is always going to end in the system beating down the people that want to experience the world differently, want to experience an alternative to the status quo,
Mhm.
right? That's why tragedy is abolished, not because it's overcome by the individual, but simply because it's the system that wins,
Mhm.
right? That's the only vision of happiness available. Hence, in that idea of the liquidation of tragedy, there is no tragedy now because there's no more conflict between the individual and the universal. The conflict between Oedipus and tragic fate, well, fate means it always goes this way, universal. Oedipus is tragic because he is struggling against that. But if Oedipus were like, you know what, this is the way things are, and in the case of Oedipus, it's um, fairly drastic because his crimes are just about the worst you can imagine, like incest with his mother and whatever. I will say, however, from the point of view of Oedipus as rational agent, incest is no worse or no better than any other sexual relationship. If you think that all people are absolutely equal and that the family does not matter, if you disregard nature, the irrational, as a source of the human, and think that the human is essentially only rational, then there's nothing wrong with incest, right? Um, but let's say that okay, so the way that that would have to work out so that Oedipus would become a corner office seeking um, cog in the corporate machine would be that is like, okay, he sees that his fate is incest, and so he just lives it up with his mother wife or something, right? But that would be the happiness that is available here. It's not that you overcome fate. You can't overcome fate. Fate wins, but you can align yourself with fate such that there's no more tension, right? So that's why they say the liquidation of tragedy confirms the abolition of the individual. In what you were saying, if you overcome fate, then it's not the abolition of the individual wins. But here, the individual is abolished because they become identical to the universal, right? I want to just say one thing about this, and then I think oh, actually, oh God, there's so many good things. One really quick thing that I won't develop, but you might want to look up yourself, is the historical development of the Greek term hamartia. I'll put that in the chat for you. Hamartia is, it literally means to, like if you're shooting an arrow and you don't hit the target, that could be described as hamartia. But it's often translated as something like tragic flaw. But the thing is that there's a lot of ambiguity about what this term meant and how it was used. And you can see this development of a kind of Enlightenment, capitalistic, or even neoliberal view of tragedy in the development of the concept of the tragic flaw. What that means is that there are essentially three candidates um, for what the tragic flaw or the hamartia, let's just call it hamartia now, what that actually referred to. One theory is that it meant something like the will of the gods, in other words, fate. But then, and that would be something that was not within the remit of the individual to affect, right? But at a certain point, it starts to be used in um, a a way that is consonant with the idea of the individual as rational, autonomous agent. It gradually turns into this idea of a character flaw and then even a moral error, right? And so what we see there is, I mean, it's really like a parallel to the critique of neoliberalism that holds that it's the individual's responsibility to fix society or something, right? This idea that all of the emphasis, once you become a self-caused autonomous agent, you're also responsible. You're not just free, but you're also responsible for the shortcomings of the world. But it's also a way of beating down the individual. The system can beat down the individual if we think that, for instance, if corporations, the system, are telling us that the only solution to the environmental crisis is that individuals need to recycle more, we can see that that is a way of disguising the responsibility and the contribution of the system to the problems of the world. But you see that in the development of the idea of the tragic flaw from something that is outside of the control of the individual to something that increasingly becomes a choice. A tragic flaw might still not be something that I'm aware of, something that I can control, but once it becomes a moral choice that I chose to do the wrong thing, then it's a way of actually destroying the very concept of tragedy. Because if it's a choice, then what a tragedy would be showing us is that it would be like a cautionary morality tale. Don't be like Hamlet, don't be like Oedipus. And there's a way to avoid tragedy. But if you think of it as something that is a matter of fate, then it is a vision of the world where there's nothing that you can do. Life just is suffering. And it's not that being moral or being rational will be a salvation from that, and that a tragic play is simply an example of someone who wasn't sufficiently rational or wasn't sufficiently moral. Once morality becomes the name of the game for the tragic flaw, then it is a vision of the world where there are explanations, there are things that we can do rationally to solve the world, to solve the problems of the world. Well, that's one thing. And then the other thing is this idea of what's going on in, say, attic tragedy versus culture industry tragedy with respect to the identical and the non-identical. Okay, so let me put it this way. Um, in Oedipus, the king, one of the things that enables the tragedy to take place is the fact that Oedipus, for all his rationality, both his moral rationality, but also his kind of, um, crime-solving rationality or whatever. For all of that, he fails to recognize that the world is much more complicated than his concepts allow him to recognize. Because, and this is the really brilliant thing about that play, um, you can think of Oedipus as the story as hinging on what you might call malicious compliance. You know what I mean by malicious compliance?
Yeah, when you do something by the letter of the law, but you do it in a way that is inconvenient.
Yeah. So what does that have to do with the identical and the non-identical? That very structure.
Um, Gosh, my last brain cells trying to
I've
string
been
this
talking more than
together.
you. Come on.
Oh,
What is the letter of the law with respect to the identical, conceptual, or non-identical, non-conceptual? What is the letter of the law?
I don't know if I understand what so identical, conceptual,
Okay,
non-identical.
yeah. So Adorno, um, somewhat obliquely here, and then later on in works like Negative Dialectics, very explicitly develops this analysis of identity and non-identity, that the non-identical is everything that cannot be captured by a concept, which means
Mhm.
actual experience, right? That that supersedes and expands beyond what concepts in their generality can capture, right? Okay. So if you say that malicious compliance is a situation where the letter of the law cannot actually capture something that both harmonizes with it, accords with it, and yet destroys it because it failed to capture the actual complexity of what it's trying to describe. I mean, that's what malicious compliance is, right? It's that
Mhm.
when I wish I could come up with a good example of malicious compliance off the top of my head, but you
It's
know,
like if you have to pay a parking ticket and you show up and you pay it all in pennies or something. I don't know.
yeah, that's not the strongest form of it because you still end up
Yeah.
paying. But yeah, I mean, there you could say, well, what is the failure? The failure is in the concept of the fine as a punishment. That the concept in that formulation of punishment is that the wrongdoer reaps the negative consequences, right? But there's something about the insufficiency of that concept to capture all the heterogeneity, all the possibility in ways that concept could be satisfied that actually undermines the concept itself. Because the punishment is supposed to go one way. It's not supposed to come back to the punisher. But in the case of pain with pennies, the concept punishment failed to capture that possibility. So that there's something beyond the concept that undermines the concept itself. And in fact, you can always come up with an exception to any concept because concepts, just by virtue of the fact that they're general, can't account for every single thing that could satisfy it. Because it could be that instead of saying, okay, well, you have to pay a ticket, and then you would say all these things like, I don't know, like the true concept would have to list all of the various exceptions that could ever possibly uh, um, come into contact with it, right? I mean, that's essentially the relationship between the identical and the non-identical. That the world that the identical is always trying to describe is always so much more complex and heterogeneous and individual and actual than the concept can capture because of the generality of the concept. So, Oedipus works exactly the same way. As I said, he is a rational, detective. He's doing all the right things. It's just that he fails to, the structure of his legal concepts or his moral concepts fails to capture the possibility that he himself is the person he's looking for. Right. And I think about it like the monkey's paw, which is another, the monkey's paw. Oh, you don't know the monkey's paw? It's like a short story from the early 20th century or something, but it's like a case of malicious compliance where there's like this, I don't know, they go to like some Nepalese merchant or something and they buy a monkey's paw that's supposed to grant wishes, but it always grants wishes in a way that undermines the intention of the wish. There's like a Simpsons episode where, so like an example would be like you wish for eternal life, but then you failed to wish for eternal youth. And so you keep growing older and more demented or whatever, and more, you know, um, your suffering increases and so on, right? Because the concept eternal life wasn't sufficient to capture all of the possibilities that could undermine it. There's a Simpsons episode where, like the third and final wish, I think Homer wishes for a turkey sandwich. He's like, I just want to wish for something that can't possibly go wrong. And then he wishes for a turkey sandwich, and this really long limousine pulls up, and a waiter comes out and hands him a tray with a turkey sandwich on it. And he takes a bite, and it's like, oh, it's a pretty good sandwich. And he says, it's a little dry. It's a little dry. Like that's the way that the wish went wrong. But that's the structure of tragedy in Oedipus as well, that the best laid plans to gain mastery over the world, that is to say, to solve the crime, who killed the king, fail to account for the actual complexity of the world, the actual complexity of nature. So that there's always more to um, the non-identical, that which extends beyond or expands beyond the concepts that we can use to try to gain mastery of the world. And then that comes back and causes the tragedy because Oedipus, if he hadn't been trying to be rational and solve the crime, wouldn't have suffered, right? Because, you know, um, there's a sense that it's precisely through knowledge and its insufficiency to actually capture the world that the world comes back and causes the tragedy, right? So that's the relationship between the identical and the non-identical in, say, Attic tragedy, that the identical is always shown to be insufficient to capture the reality of the world. And it's just because of its insufficiency that tragedy occurs. But then in the culture industry, there's kind of an inversion, right? It's the rationalization of society that can't be eluded, right? So it's not that there's more to the world than rationality allows us to capture. Fate itself, nature, whatever, becomes the standardized system. So it's rationality itself that is the cause of oppression. We always get pulled back into the system. There's no escape from the fully known, the fully standardized. We can never have unique experiences, true sort of non-standardized happiness or whatever, because the culture industry presents the world as fully rationalized, that there's nothing outside the concept. There's nothing outside of rationality. But that in itself is its own sort of tragic state. So that's maybe another way to look at it. Good. You want to have the last word?
Um, no, I everything you said.
All right. Well, I will see you in the future then, next quarter probably.
Yeah,
All right.
sounds
Yep.
good.
Take care. All right. Bye bye.